Hey guys, welcome back to The Readers. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is an entitled People Story. I never thought I'd be writing one of these posts, but after everything that happened with my family over the past month, I need to get this off my chest. This whole situation started when my great-aunt passed away and left me something in her will that my family thought they deserved more than me. Let me start from the beginning. My great-aunt was always the black sheep of the family. She never married, lived alone in this modest cottage by the lake about an hour outside the city, and had what my family liked to call a difficult personality. What they really meant was that she had boundaries and wasn't afraid to enforce them. While my uncle and cousin spent years talking about how weird she was behind her back, I actually got to know her. About 5 years ago, I started visiting her regularly. It wasn't anything dramatic or calculated. I was going through a rough patch in my life and needed somewhere quiet to clear my head. She had this beautiful property right on the water, and when I asked if I could come by sometimes just to walk around and think, she said yes. Those visits turned into something more. I'd bring groceries when I came, help her with small repairs around the house, and we'd sit on her porch talking about life. She was actually pretty funny once you got past her no-nonsense exterior. She told me stories about growing up in the area, about how the lake used to be completely different, about all the changes she'd seen over the decades. The property itself wasn't anything fancy. The cottage was probably built in the 1940s and needed work. The roof leaked in 2 places, the kitchen hadn't been updated since the 1980s, and the heating system was temperamental at best. But it sat on almost 2 acres of prime lakefront land, and even I knew that was worth something substantial these days. During those 5 years of visits, my family barely acknowledged she existed. My uncle would make jokes at family gatherings about her becoming a crazy old lady living alone. My cousin would roll her eyes whenever someone mentioned visiting, saying she didn't have time to deal with difficult people. They both lived less than 20 minutes from her place, but I could count on one hand the number of times either of them had been there in the past decade. She also had this beautiful hand-carved desk in her living room. It was solid oak, probably made in the early 1900s, with intricate patterns carved into the legs and sides. The family always made fun of it, calling it that ugly old thing, and wondering why she wouldn't just get a normal computer desk like everyone else. But I loved that desk. She told me her grandfather made it himself, and you could tell it was built to last forever. The week before she died, I was there helping her organize some paperwork. She seemed tired, but otherwise normal. We talked about maybe getting someone in to fix the roof properly before winter came. She mentioned she'd been thinking about updating her will and wanted to make sure everything was in order. I didn't think much of it at the time. When the call came that she'd passed peacefully in her sleep, I was sad but not surprised. She was 86 and had been slowing down. What did surprise me was getting a call from her lawyer 3 days later asking me to come in to discuss matters pertaining to the estate. That's when I learned she'd left me the cottage and the land, the whole thing, along with the hand-carved desk and a few other personal items. I was honestly shocked. I knew we'd grown close over the years, but I never expected anything like this. The lawyer explained that she'd updated her will about 6 months earlier. She'd left small amounts to a few charities and some jewelry to distant relatives, but the bulk of her estate came to me. He mentioned that she'd been very specific about wanting someone who would appreciate the property and had shown genuine care for her well-being to inherit it. I called my parents first to let them know what happened. They were surprised but supportive. They'd always liked that I spent time with her and thought it was sweet that she'd remembered me in her will. But then my dad suggested I should probably call my uncle to let him know about the inheritance, since there might be family dynamics I should be aware of. That turned out to be an understatement. I called my uncle that evening. He seemed fine at first, expressing condolences and asking about funeral arrangements. But when I mentioned the inheritance, the tone of the conversation changed completely. He got very quiet for a moment, then said he thought we should discuss this as a family, and maybe I shouldn't make any hasty decisions about the property. I told him there wasn't really anything to discuss. The will was clear and had already been filed with probate court, but he insisted we should all get together soon to talk things through properly. He said he'd coordinate with my cousin and they'd come by my place sometime in the next week or 2. The funeral was small and awkward. My uncle and cousin showed up but spent most of the time talking quietly between themselves and shooting glances in my direction. I heard my cousin mention something about legal options and undue influence, but I tried to focus on honoring my great-aunt's memory rather than whatever they were plotting. A week after the funeral, they showed up at my house unannounced. I was working in my home office when I heard the doorbell, and there they were standing on my porch with a pizza and apologetic smiles. My uncle immediately started talking about how sorry he was for not being more present during my great-aunt's final years, and how much he appreciated that I'd been there for her when the family couldn't be. My cousin nodded along, saying she felt terrible about not making more effort to visit. I invited them in, though something felt off about the whole situation. We sat in my living room with the pizza between us, and for the first 10 minutes, it almost felt like a normal family visit. They asked about work, mentioned some family news, and generally acted like caring relatives checking in after a difficult time. Then my uncle shifted in his chair and said he wanted to talk about the situation with the property. He explained that he'd been thinking a lot about what would be best for everyone involved, and he was concerned that I might not fully understand what I'd gotten myself into. He started talking about property taxes, maintenance costs, and the responsibility of owning lakefront real estate. He said he'd done some research and found that the annual property taxes alone were over $8,000. Add in insurance, regular maintenance, and the repairs that cottage clearly needed. And I'd be looking at spending $20,000 or $30,000 a year just to keep the place. My cousin jumped in at that point, saying she'd been doing her own research and thought the whole inheritance situation was problematic from a family perspective. She said it didn't seem right that someone who wasn't a direct descendant should inherit property that had been in the family for generations, especially when there were closer relatives who could make better use of it. That's when my uncle dropped his bombshell. He said he'd been thinking about setting up a family trust to properly manage inherited properties, and he thought it would be best for everyone if I signed the cottage over to this trust. He'd manage it as the trustee, and any income from the property could be shared among family members according to what was fair and appropriate. I asked what he meant by fair and appropriate, and he got a little vague. He said these things needed to be worked out carefully with proper legal advice, but the important thing was keeping the property in the family name where it belonged. My cousin added that they'd been talking to people who knew my great-aunt well, and there were concerns about whether she'd been fully competent when she made her most recent will. She said several people had mentioned that she'd seemed confused or forgetful in her final months, and there might be grounds to challenge the will in court. Then my uncle delivered what was clearly meant to be the killing blow. He said they didn't want to put the family through a messy legal battle, but if I forced their hand by being unreasonable about this, they'd have no choice but to file a challenge with the probate court. He said it would be expensive and stressful for everyone, and there was a real chance the court might invalidate the entire will if they found evidence of undue influence or diminished capacity. He leaned forward and put on his most sincere expression, saying he really hoped we could work this out as family without involving lawyers and judges. All I needed to do was do the right thing and transfer the property to the family trust, and we could all move forward without any hard feelings. I sat there for a moment, letting it all sink in. They'd clearly planned this whole approach carefully. The timing, the fake sympathy, the legal threats wrapped in family concerns. It was actually pretty impressive in its calculated manipulation. But instead of getting angry or defensive like they probably expected, I found myself getting very calm. I looked at both of them and said that, you know what? They might actually be right about this. If my great-aunt had made promises to family members that I wasn't aware of, I wouldn't want to be the person standing in the way of honoring those promises. My uncle's eyes lit up immediately. He started talking about how glad he was that I was being reasonable about this, and how much he appreciated that I understood the importance of family. My cousin jumped in to say that they'd been worried about having to fight with me over this, and it was such a relief to see that I cared more about doing what's right than about keeping something that might not rightfully belong to me. I let them think they'd won for a few more minutes, nodding along as they talked about family unity and proper inheritance procedures. Then I said I had an idea that might work for everyone. I told them that if there were verbal promises or commitments that my great-aunt had made to family members, I absolutely wanted to honor those. And if they'd provided financial support for her care or property maintenance over the years, it would only be fair to compensate them for that investment. My uncle started to say something about how generous that was, but I held up my hand and said I wanted to make sure we did this properly. If we were going to restructure the inheritance, it needed to be done legally and transparently, with everything documented correctly. I proposed what I called a fair share agreement. I told them that if they could provide written documentation of any promises my great-aunt had made to them about inheritance, or receipts and records showing financial support they'd provided for her in the past 5 years, I would calculate their fair share based on that evidence. Not only would I give them what they were owed, but I'd add a 20% bonus on top of that to show my appreciation for their care and loyalty. The greed was practically visible on their faces. My cousin immediately started talking about how my great-aunt had definitely mentioned leaving her something substantial, and my uncle nodded along saying he'd spent quite a bit of money on property repairs and maintenance over the years. I said that sounded perfectly reasonable, but if we were going to do this officially, everything would need to be properly documented and notarized. I didn't want any confusion or disputes down the line, so they'd need to provide sworn affidavits detailing exactly what they were owed and why they were owed it. I explained that once we had all the documentation together, we could take it to an estate lawyer and work out a settlement that would satisfy everyone. That way, there wouldn't be any need for a messy court battle, and the family could move forward with clear ownership of the property. They agreed immediately. My uncle said he'd gather up all his receipts and documentation, and my cousin said she'd work on putting together a detailed account of her interactions with our great-aunt. They left my house that evening convinced they'd just maneuvered me into giving away a substantial inheritance. Over the next week, I got regular updates from both of them about their progress putting together their claims. My cousin called to say she'd found an old birthday card that referenced future inheritance plans. My uncle stopped by to show me a stack of receipts he'd found for various home improvement projects. Meanwhile, I'd been doing some research of my own. I went back to the cottage and spent several days going through my great-aunt's personal papers more carefully. That's when I discovered something interesting hidden in the desk she'd left me. The hand-carved desk had a secret compartment that I'd never noticed before. When I was moving it to clean behind it, I accidentally triggered a hidden panel that revealed a small space containing several journals and logbooks dating back almost 15 years. My great-aunt had been meticulously documenting her daily life, including every interaction with family members, every expense, and every visitor to the property. She'd recorded phone calls, visits, and even attempted contacts from relatives. The level of detail was incredible. As I read through the most recent entries, I started to understand why she'd been so careful about documentation. There were multiple entries about my uncle calling to ask for money, about family members only reaching out when they needed something, and about feeling forgotten and abandoned by everyone except me. But the really interesting entries were the ones that directly contradicted the claims my uncle and cousin were preparing to make. My cousin's proof centered around claiming that our great-aunt had specifically promised her the cottage during a conversation at a family Christmas party 2 years earlier. But according to my great-aunt's journal entry from that exact date, my cousin had spent the entire evening complaining about having to visit, had made several rude comments about the cottage being a dump, and had left early without even saying goodbye. My uncle's receipts were even more interesting when cross-referenced with the journals. He'd put together an impressive collection of invoices for roofing work, HVAC maintenance, and general repairs totaling almost $15,000 over the past 3 years. But my great-aunt's daily logs showed that during the time period covered by those receipts, my uncle had been asking her for loans to cover his own home repairs because he'd lost his job and was having financial troubles. Even better, she'd noted specific dates when he'd called claiming he was too broke to help with her property taxes, followed by entries describing how frustrated she was that no one in the family seemed to care about her financial struggles. But I didn't say anything about the journals yet. I wanted to see exactly how far they'd go with their fabricated claims. A week and a half after our family meeting, my cousin called to say she'd finished putting together her documentation and was ready to submit everything officially. My uncle called the same day saying he had his paperwork ready and wanted to schedule the meeting with an estate lawyer as soon as possible. We arranged to meet at the law office that had handled the original estate. I brought my copy of the will and all the probate documents, while they arrived with manila folders full of their evidence. The lawyer listened carefully as both my uncle and cousin presented their cases. My cousin produced what she claimed was a handwritten note from our great-aunt promising her a substantial portion of the lakefront property to ensure it stays in the family. My uncle presented his receipts along with a typed statement claiming our great-aunt had repeatedly told him he'd be taken care of in the will because of all the financial support he'd provided. Both of them signed sworn affidavits attesting to the accuracy of their claims under penalty of perjury. They seemed confident and proud of their documentation as they handed over the notarized papers. The lawyer said he'd need some time to review everything and would get back to us with his assessment of how to proceed. But I asked if I could present some additional documentation that might be relevant to the case. That's when I brought out my great-aunt's journals. I explained to everyone how I discovered the hidden compartment in the desk and the detailed records my great-aunt had kept of her daily life. I said I thought it would be important to cross-reference their claims against her contemporaneous notes to make sure we had the full picture of her intentions. The change in atmosphere was immediate. My uncle started to say something about old people sometimes misremembering things or writing down confused thoughts, but the lawyer was already examining the journals with obvious interest. I opened to the entry from the date my cousin claimed our great-aunt had promised her the cottage. The lawyer read aloud my great-aunt's actual notes about that Christmas party, including the comment that my cousin had made it very clear she thinks this place is worthless and can't wait to leave. Then I showed him the entries corresponding to my uncle's repair receipts. affidavits. My great-aunt had written detailed notes about my uncle calling to ask for money during that exact time period, including specific amounts he'd requested and her explanations of why she couldn't afford to help him. But the most damaging evidence came from entries my great-aunt had written just a few months before updating her will. She'd documented a phone conversation with my uncle where he'd apparently suggested she should just sell that money pit and move into assisted living so the family wouldn't have to worry about her anymore. The lawyer looked up from the journals and asked my uncle and cousin if they wanted to revise their sworn statements in light of this new information. That's when everything fell apart for them. My cousin started backtracking immediately, saying maybe she'd misremembered exactly what our great-aunt had said, or maybe it had been a different conversation at a different time. My uncle got defensive and angry, claiming the journals were probably fake or at least exaggerated and that old people couldn't be trusted to remember things accurately anyway. But the lawyer explained that it was too late for revisions. They'd already submitted sworn affidavits claiming specific interactions and financial contributions. If those claims were false, they weren't just mistaken. They were potentially criminal. He said that submitting fraudulent documentation to support inheritance claims could be prosecuted as a state fraud, which in our state was a felony carrying potential prison time and substantial fines. Since they'd signed the affidavits under penalty of perjury, they'd essentially confessed to attempted fraud in writing. The room went completely quiet. My uncle tried to argue that this was all a misunderstanding, that they'd never intended to defraud anyone, they just wanted to make sure the inheritance was handled fairly. But the lawyer pointed out that their evidence wasn't just mistaken. It was actively contradicted by contemporaneous records. The fake receipts, the fabricated conversations, the forged note, it all pointed to a deliberate scheme to steal property through false documentation. I let them sit with that for a moment, then I made my final offer. I said that despite everything that had happened, I still believed in family relationships and didn't want to see anyone go to prison over this, so I was willing to make them a deal. If they immediately withdrew all claims to the estate and agreed to have no further contact with me regarding the inheritance, I would not turn their fraudulent affidavits over to the district attorney's office. They could walk away from this situation embarrassed but not imprisoned. However, if they continued to pursue their claims or tried to challenge the will in court, I would provide their sworn false statements to law enforcement and let them handle it from there. I also made it clear that this was a one-time offer. If they left the lawyer's office and started making threats or trying to cause problems for me later, the deal was off, and I'd pursue criminal charges immediately. My uncle started to say something about this being unfair and me taking advantage of a simple misunderstanding, but my cousin grabbed his arm and told him to shut up. She could see exactly how deep a hole they dug for themselves. They both signed papers withdrawing their claims and acknowledging that the original will should stand as written. Then they left the lawyer's office looking like people who'd just realized they'd been massively outplayed. That was 3 weeks ago, and I haven't heard from either of them since. My uncle tried to send one text message saying he hoped we could still work things out as family, but I blocked his number immediately. The cottage is officially mine now, and I've been spending weekends there getting it cleaned up and making plans for renovations. The first thing I did was restore the hand-carved desk that held the key to unraveling their whole scheme. It's beautiful when it's properly cared for, just like my great-aunt always said. But here's the thing that still amazes me about this whole situation. They could have just been decent family members from the beginning. They could have visited her, helped her out occasionally, and probably would have been remembered in the will naturally. She wasn't a vindictive person. She was just lonely and tired of being treated like she didn't matter. Instead, they chose to ignore her completely until they smelled money, then tried to steal an inheritance through fraud and intimidation. Their own greed became the tool I used to defeat them. Looking back, I realized my great-aunt probably knew exactly what would happen after she died. She'd been documenting their behavior for years, and she'd seen how they treated family relationships as purely transactional. The detailed journals weren't just personal record-keeping. They were insurance against exactly the kind of scheme they tried to pull. She'd given me the perfect weapon to defend against their greed, hidden in the piece of furniture they'd always dismissed as worthless. Sometimes I wonder if she knew about the secret compartment when she specifically left me that desk, or if that was just a fortunate coincidence. Either way, I'm grateful for the time I got to spend with her and for the lessons she taught me about standing up for yourself when family tries to take advantage. The cottage needs a lot of work, but it's going to be beautiful when it's finished. And every time I sit at that carved oak desk, I'll remember the woman who showed me that the best revenge against greedy people is letting them expose themselves. The next one is a malicious compliance story. My wife recently performed some tasty malicious compliance, so I thought I'd combine it with her previous MC from 6 months previous. My wife works in the finance department for a government contractor. They're hybrid, but mostly all work from home due to limited office space, with the expectation her team is on site Montus. In this role, she has a busy end of month every month with the whole team working to post figures and is often required to work late into the evening or a few hours on the weekend to finalize the month end. This is important for later. Due to insane commuter traffic, she prefers to start at 7 and finish at 3 p.m. so that the commute is 30 minutes instead of an hour or more each way just sitting in congested traffic. 6 months or so ago, Manglement issued an edict requiring core hours, 8-4, when in the office and more in-office days. My wife emails management stating that requiring her to sit in traffic for a wasted additional 4-5 hours a week would mean her evening and weekend flexibility would no longer be available. Cue a management response of, team player blah blah. My wife responds with a breakdown of time within her paid 40x-hour week and how the flexibility established and continued since COVID has benefited the team, but as that flexibility is being reduced, it has a natural effect on her flexibility. They insist. So she leaves the office after core hours, gets stuck in traffic, and suddenly misses the end of day team's call. Of course, Manglement don't appreciate this reality, but she has the emails of their insistence, can't control traffic patterns, and Manglement don't want to schedule the meeting earlier. If they want her on the call, either she reverts to her original schedule or enters into overtime to take it in the office. They suggest her previous schedule for the foreseeable future to aid team cohesion. Recently, her Manglement decided that all overtime has to now be approved by a direct line manager. Cut to last week, my wife has been exiting meetings on the dot at the hour. Sorry, I've got a hard stop now due to no approved OT BAM drops from the meeting. She's even starting to affect other team members, with her and a colleague ceasing work on the dot due to not approved. Management is of course on the hook for incomplete end-of-month figures and starts inquiring. The team replies with the OT edict. All OT to require manager approval. It wasn't pre-approved, so I stopped working to adhere to the new policy. My wife mentioned they haven't responded to this yet, but it's been weeks already. All of this after management still hasn't backfilled an open department position for 5x months, so they're down an additional person. I am now thoroughly enjoying her work stories, and think reading this sub to her over the years may have had a positive impact. The next one is an entitled People Story. This story needs a little background, so stay with me. My real grandfather died when my dad was 15. Grandma married again, and that man was my grandpa, and I loved him. For the first 10 years of my life, I didn't even know we weren't related. He was amazing and he literally spoiled me. But he never adopted my dad. It wasn't a normal thing to do then, and later dad was already adult, so they didn't even think about it. Unfortunately, we lost him due to cancer when I was 11. He knew he will die, so he told me about his history so he could warn me about my step-uncles. He was married before and had 2 sons, but his wife was cheating on him and he divorced her. Those 2 boys might even not be his, but at the time, he was listed in birth certificate as father and nobody cared about what if. And DNA testing wasn't a thing then. Both boys cut all contact with him. He tried for years to have contact with them, but they refused, even as adults, and said pretty nasty things. One of his sons, let's call him Other Uncle, because I never seen him, didn't talk to him for 25 years. Other one, Evil Uncle, you'll see why later, did contacted him 15 years ago to get my grandpa to pay of his debts and get free housing for him and his wife, just to try steal grandpa's house when they moved in with him. So yeah, no more contact for him either. Grandpa also never met his own grandchildren. That was the main reason why he spoiled me so much. I was his second chance to be grandfather. When my grandpa entered final stage of cancer and was in hospital, Evil Uncle and Other Uncle visited him for the first time since last contacts, 25 and 15 years ago, with paperwork that said grandpa is gifting his house to them, and tried to force my heavily sedated grandpa to sign it. Thankfully, nurse came in and kicked them out. After that, grandma took him home and took care of him herself to protect him. He died peacefully in his bed. Both uncles came to the will reading, where everyone, even my parents, were shocked I was named as the only inheritor. That enraged my step-uncles, especially the Evil Uncle. They immediately brought it to court. I was represented by my dad. I was 11 after all. So I don't know details, but we won it 2 years later. Other Uncle acknowledged it and disappeared again, but Evil Uncle appealed the judgment and it went back to the court for 3 more years. We won it again, but it took emotional and financial toll on our family, and we had to sell the house, so that is the background of the story. Now to the main event. A few days after we won, some realtor used a key and entered the house where my grandma still lived and told her son is selling and in next 10 minutes there will be a tour. She was shocked, but she knew we want to sell, so she didn't make the big deal out of it. But when they left, she called my dad and told him he could at least warned her. That is how we found out about the listing on the internet, put on there almost a month ago, when we were still fighting at court. There were even photos of the interior. Dad tried to call the realtor, but he was blocked, so he told Grandma to call him if they ever came back, which had happened 2 days later. She said the same realtor is there, telling her there will be 2 tours this time. Dad went there immediately. He must have break couple of laws because 3-hour drive took him less that too, and confronted the realtor. And that is how we found out the whole story. Someone had called them about selling the house. The fake seller told the realtor that he is abroad, that he was at court because of the house and just won. He had sent them fake paperwork and of course they didn't verify it. They just saw the money they could make. He mailed them keys. The keys evil uncle didn't retuned when he moved out. Grandpa didn't change locks, and told him when to enter and made photos and even made some tours before they were caught. It was the dates when court hearings were, so Grandma wasn't home. And my dad was blocked, because fake seller told them that it is number of thief who is trying to steal his house. They never saw the fake seller, and we couldn't prove it was evil uncle. Even when we knew it was him, that keys still had a keychain my grandpa put on them when he gave them to him. And we couldn't prove the realtor knew about any foul play. Of course, police didn't help at all, just gave the realtor a warning and told him to delete the listing. He even had the audacity to try convince my dad to continue selling with them, but my dad refused. Now you might think, why the realtor is the evil one too? He truly might not know. And that is true, even though they were guilty of negligence when they didn't verify the ownership, which is the easiest thing to do. Everyone can do it. What he was guilty of is how he tried to scam my dad out of money after this. He sent us an invoice for breaking the sales agency agreement. You know, the contract we never signed because we weren't the ones who put on the listing. They wanted 10% from listing price of the house, or keep being the only realtors who is listing our house, which will guarantee them 10% as commission. That realtor truly believed my dad is some countryside simpleton that he can scam. Unfortunately for him, so close after the court, we still were in contract with very expensive and very good lawyer, who quickly reminded him how easily we can sue if we want to. So, invoice was taken back, and we never were contacted by them again. But the audacity. Thank you for hearing me out. In the end, it had kinda happy ending. We used money that was left from selling the house and bought apartment just 30 minutes walk from us, where Grandma spent rest of her years, visited by us every week, and where I live now. Anyway, thank you for watching.